Good morning and welcome to this morning's webinar, Net Zero, Turning Ideas into Action. This morning I'm joined by John Chu from Interface, Carol Sumper, Head of Sustainability at JRP Solutions, and Simon Matthews, who's Projects Director also at JRP Solutions. So we're going to be talking about turning ideas around net zero, turning your strategies into practical action. John's going to be talking about the experience at Interface, who obviously have been well practiced and have been one of the leading lights in sustainability for a number of decades now, while Carol will be talking about processes, procurement management systems and business governments, and Simon will be talking about more about technical projects, cost thereof, different finance and delivery mechanisms. And then finally, we'll be talking about supplier engagement, behaviour change and culture. There will be an opportunity to ask questions. We will, if time allows, answer as many of those as we can at the end. Otherwise, we'll answer them post-webinar individually. Next slide, please. Over to John.
Thank you, George, and also thank you to Carol, George and Simon and JRP Solutions for inviting me to join you today. I'm just going to take a few minutes to share our journey and a few perspectives on how we're looking to get to net zero and where we are today. Next slide, please. Fundamentally, we're a flooring company. I'm going to be honest, it's not the most exciting of trades, but that's the key point here. We're a normal company making pretty normal products that you'll see in your office or in a cinema or in a school. We're not some kind of tech giant or disruptive innovator. And I think a lot of the companies on the call today might be in a similar position. You may be doing remarkable stuff that's very different, but actually might be part of the mainstream, part of the bulk. And that's certainly what we were back in the 70s to the 90s. Next slide, please. What changed that was a question that we got from our customers. What are you doing about the environment? Today, that question might be from your investors or your employees or a whole range of other stakeholders or your customers. Now, this is Roy Anson. He founded the company in 1973, and up until 1994, up till nearly 30 years ago, he hadn't really thought much about the environment. But when posed with this question, he did a thing that most leaders today must do, which he listened to the science, listened to the challenges to the business. And what he realized is Interface, his very successful creation, was damaging the planet. And his realization was, we have a choice to make during the time we spend on this planet. Are we going to hurt it or are we going to help it? And what he resolved was that he was going to help it, that he was going to find a way to run a successful business that also did good for the planet. So he set us on our first sustainability mission, Mission Zero, which was to try and negate our negative impact by 2020. Next slide, please. So where have we got so far? Well, as of last year, we're now certified as a carbon neutral enterprise. So whether it's in our operations under scopes 1, 2 and 3, or in our products themselves, we've worked hard to reduce our impact. So for example, we've reduced our greenhouse gas emissions in our operations by 96%. And renewable energy, everything we use in all of our 6 manufacturing sites for electricity is renewable. And we're well on track to getting all of our energy being renewable in the next couple of years. On our main product, the carpet tile, we've reduced the carbon footprint by 76%. How have we done that? By embracing the circular economy, by working with our supply chain. And we've chosen to use the PAS 2060 certification, but I know Carol's going to pick up on some other options that you might want to take. This just happens to be a snapshot of where we've got to. Now, to me, there's a lot of debate around carbon neutral, whether you should use a phrase or not, when you're on a path towards net zero. For me, it's very much a milestone. It's not a destination. Our ultimate aim now, under our Mission Climate Takeback, is to be a carbon negative enterprise by 2040. By that, in terms of net zero, I don't think we'll hit absolute net zero, but I think we'll be able to get close to it and be able to use carbon removals to cover around about 10%. Next slide, please. A few practical thoughts to finish on how we're going to achieve this. Firstly, you need the right kind of leader. So we have a new CEO as of last year. This is Laurel Hurd. And the thing about Laurel is, as with Ray Anson, she hasn't come from a sustainable background. It's not like we want to go and find the equivalent of a Paul Polman or Yvonne Chouinard. But what she's doing, which I think is brilliant, is she's being humble, she's listening to the science, she's listening to the employees, and she's not about the ego. She doesn't want to be kind of praised in the same way Ray was. She wants to empower her teams and other leaders around the business to make the change. In addition, in relation to our path to net zero, we have a science-based target for 2030, part of which, and the main part of it as a manufacturer, is around scope 3, and attacking our purchased goods and services. Now, this is going to require us to really work with our value chain, to work with our suppliers, to understand the impact they have on us and how we can share lessons, but also to work with our customers. For we, as a manufacturer of flooring, are part of their scope 3. So that dialogue across the value chain is very important. And then finally, to make this happen, we need to bring our employees with us. This is our sales team. And what's different about them from other sales teams is they act less like normal type A sales folk, but they're actually more like little climate corporate activists out there going to our customers. And instead of saying, let's just talk price and design, let's have a conversation about carbon. Let's have a conversation about how our products can help you achieve your goals. That is the combination that will help us get to net zero. One last remark, which is, I wish we'd had a JRP Solutions to help us back on our sustainability journey. And I hand over to the guys today, because hopefully they'll be a key part of unlocking your journey to net zero. And we'll hopefully show all of each other at the finish line sometime in the next couple of decades. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Next slide, please. Okay, so just a very, very brief background to JRP for those of you who don't know who we are. We've been around for some time, since 1999. We're regarded as being the UK's leading independent energy, net zero and outsourcing specialists. We are technology and supplier agnostic, which puts us in a great position to give our clients the best advice. And we come from a very pragmatic and practical background. So we don't just come up with hypothetical suggestions, that they are embedded in practical knowledge and experience. Because at the end of the day, whilst we all are on this journey to achieve net zero by 2050 at the latest, and some sooner than that, we also need to survive as businesses, and obviously remain commercially viable. So that's our general sort of approach. We work across all sectors, and we also walk the walk. So we're 9,000 and 50,001 certified, and last year we became a B Corp and have ourselves a 2030 net zero target. So next slide, please. Okay, so these are our 4 core business areas. You can see we started off as an energy management specialist back in '99, but about 4 or 5 years ago, we began to transition to become a broader net zero consultancy. And since when, we've worked with quite a number of organisations at different stages in their own journeys to help them with different aspects of net zero, whether it's from helping them to understand what it is, to then developing an appropriate net zero strategy and practical action plan. And with some that are a little bit more mature on those journeys, we're now helping them to implement those plans. And of course, it's almost come full circle, the whole conversation. Sustainability 5-6 years ago was not really that well understood. It was quite woolly, if you like. It was not particularly well defined. Net zero was much better defined, although we have spent quite a lot of time helping people to understand what it actually is and what it means to them. And it's come back round, and it's now being called ESG, of which net zero is part. ESG is basically what was always called sustainability, as I'm sure some of you will understand. So if you hear ESG, it's basically the same as sustainability, and net zero is part of that. So next slide, please. And of course, you know, times are changing, and they, you know, I've been around for a long time. If you can see me, you see my hairline, you know I've been around for a few decades now. But I've never experienced so much change in such a short period of time, both from a political and social economic perspective, driven by obviously a greater awareness of climate change and the effects that's having on us all, and also most recently the so-called energy crisis, which has brought a greater focus quite naturally on reducing scope 1, scope 2, i.e. Your own direct energy costs as a business, because in some cases that's a matter of actual survival. So there's a natural focus on that, but that doesn't mean there has to be a disconnect between that and net zero, because after all, your energy is your scope 1, scope 2. Next slide, please. Yeah, which is exactly what I've been saying. In terms of balancing energy savings and your net zero journey, it just means that you obviously have to have a short-term focus on immediate cost savings, which is great because that feeds into your net zero plan anyway. You have to look at your scope 1, scope 2, but that doesn't mean you do it to the exclusion of looking at scope 3 and doing implementing other actions to help you move towards net zero. Next slide, please. So taking you through a simple lateral process, starting off with a gap analysis. So this process is designed really to get any organization from where they are today, to understand where they are today, to understand where they've got to get to and how they're going to get there. So the gap analysis looks at the organization as it stands today, looks at its carbon footprint, so looking across all 3 scopes, looking at how you engage with your suppliers, etc., etc. And from that, you will get a much better understanding of where you're at, and also a longer term net zero strategy, and together with a 3 to 5 year shorter term action plan. So that's dealing with the knowns of today, the technology that's available, the cost of carbon, the cost of energy, etc., etc. So it's dealing with the here and now, and obviously identify specific costed measures and projects, which we'll talk a little bit more about later on with Carol and Simon. Next slide, please. So you've calculated your carbon footprint, and this is just an example of that. Next slide, please. You've identified your main emitters. Next slide, please. You've carried out a governance review. And next slide. And you've got a trajectory for reducing your GHG emissions to the point of achieving net zero. Next slide, please. And there is an example of a high-level action plan. Next slide, please. But now what? A lot of organizations feel that even when they've done that initial piece of work, they understand where they're at, they understand where they have to get to and within what time frame, but quite often feel as though they're now left holding the baby. And that doesn't have to be the case, of course. Next slide, please. So there are 3 areas for practical action, which I'm now going to hand over to Carol to take you through that.
Good morning, everybody. Can I have the next slide, please? So it really all does start at governance, and I think that John's introductory presentation explained why. It's got to start at the top. There has to be real desire at the top to make a change, because the net zero strategy has to be embedded into the business plan, the corporate strategy going forward. It needs to be owned by the top team. It needs to be a standing item on their agenda, so that there are executive sponsors for the processes and the activities required to meet those agreed business objectives and those milestones. And it's all about looking back at your policies, your operating procedures and the processes behind those at every level of the business to make sure that net zero is explicit in there, that the ways of working in order to achieve net zero are understood and owned at every level of the business. So setting the right objectives and targets around your strategy are absolutely critical. And I really like this little quote from Zurich. Good corporate citizenship has become as important as profitability, ultimately because it's absolutely critical to achieving profitability where we are now. And those risks must be understood and must be owned by the board of directors. Next slide, please. So in looking at your governance hierarchy, this is a good example of one, so that you've got your top policy, overarching policy. You can call it what you want, corporate responsibility or ESG policy. And in this particular instance, it's been split up into environment, social capital and responsible investment and finance. So make this hierarchy tailored to how you operate. And the green shading is trying to show how the environmental aspects where net zero fits in environmental management feeds across into every other aspect, so that when you're looking at how does this process actually work out on the ground in the end, looking at the outcomes, that whatever organization you are, whatever type of business or sector you are, that those outcomes are the results of how you've set up to operate, and those outcomes are positive across society, economy and environment. Because I think we've got to stop talking about the three pillars. It should be one pillar of absolutely integrated environmental, social, ethical and economic for prosperity for everyone. Next slide, please. So it's really important to use credible and established standards, and there are a lot out there. John talked about the PAS 2060 standard by BSI, and that's a great standard, but it's not the only one. And we use with our clients the Greenhouse Gas Protocol developed by the World Resources Institute, and that is the global gold standard for greenhouse gas accounting. It's the how you do it. And WRI have joined forces with the Carbon Disclosure Project, the UN Global Compact. The UN obviously is responsible for setting up the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and they're a set. They come as a set. You can't be selective and just choose a few. You've got to look at how that entire set applies to what you do and how you operate. ISO is really important here, the International Standards Organization, and very often BSI is quite groundbreaking and will develop a standard as a publicly available standard, or PAS, and works very closely with ISO. ISO has working groups from across the world, and they will set up new global standards. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that shortly. So all of these different organisations, WRI, CDP, not so much the UN as an NGO, but the World Business Council for Sustainable Development and Worldwide Fund for Nature. These are big hitting NGOs, and the NGO sector tends to be a lot more forward thinking and active than governments. Governments follow where these NGOs lead, and you can see where this consortium of big hitters has established the Science Based Targets Initiative. CDP is particularly important here because of the wealth of information that they've been collecting for over a decade or more now, by getting information on individual corporate journeys to emissions reduction targets, also cities and in some cases states, and they have a wealth of information that they've been able to use in setting up the SBTI, so that there are sectoral science-based decarbonisation trajectories now that are increasingly leading the way, that we can go. It's no longer about just guessing, can we decarbonise by 10% within the next 5 years? If you have a science-based target, you know what the trajectory should be from when you set your baseline to when you feel that you can decarbonise. And getting third-party assurance and verification of your own calculations in your decarbonisation journey are where organisations like UCAS come in. Third-party verification and validation is really important, because you can't really mark your own homework. Next slide, please. So the great work that the International Standards Organization is doing is now looking at developing a net zero standard for how you get to net zero. So we have an open source standard at the moment created by the SBTI, which was launched in 2022 or at the end of 21, the Net Zero Global Standard. And that tells you how to use the accounting guidance, like the corporate standards from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, to get to net zero. And it's all about reduce, reduce, reduce as far as you can, particularly in scopes 1 and 2, start engaging with your supply chain. And interestingly, the SBTI was very cautious about advocating offsetting, but the Net Zero Global Standard from SBTI talks about carbon abatement out of the supply chain. That is offsetting. And there are very credible ways of doing offsetting. And I would direct you to the gold standard particularly, and their registry of projects. The gold standard also develop their own methodologies, and those methodologies are independently verified as well. Anyway, coming back to ISO 14068, this has been under review for a few years now, and a draft is expected to be decided on by the end of February this year. So we should very soon know exactly what that new standard is looking like. And I would bet a shed load of money that it's going to very closely follow the Greenhouse Gas Protocol standards and guidance and the SBTI net zero standard. And why come up with this standard then if you've already got the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and SBTI? It's around the certification process. I think that ISO 14068 is going to replace PAS 2060, and it's going to make it possible for UCAS and similar accredited auditing bodies to be able to audit organisations' net zero roadmaps, the sort of thing that George very briefly explained at the beginning of this webinar. And that's important because it's going to bring a lot of consistency to how people are doing things. And because it's going to be a third-party certification process, I think we'll see a huge improvement in the consistency of corporate net zero programs going forward. Next slide, please. I've used this in webinars before, and I think it's really important to come back to, because this is how to get the governance piece working really well. And it really is important to have some sort of environmental management system to fit your net zero practice and procedures into, so that it's structured, it's being monitored. If you don't monitor and measure, you don't know where you are in your improvements process. So it very is much about plan out what you need to do it, act it, review the whole process, and then do it all again. It's this virtuous circle of performance improvement. It's got to start with engagement and ownership at the top. It's got to go through really good planning, looking at all of the risks in your operations, down your supply chain, and making sure that you're understanding across the whole organisation what that means, and the obligations and actions that need to be taken out, the sort of support you might need, the competencies, and how well all of that is communicated, all the way through to doing it, having really good operational practices and controls, being prepared to react to emergency situations and anomalies, and keeping up with that performance evaluation. That is absolutely critical, so that you really are correcting and improving all the way along the journey. It's going to get harder. You're going to have to squeeze the pips as you get better at doing this. A lot of effort's needed for the last bit, but that's what's necessary for that journey to net zero. Next slide, please. And procurement really matters to your EMS, because a lot of the issues around resource efficiency, good waste management, reducing and minimising waste is done at source. If you buy differently and you buy better, you can reduce your waste arisings that way. You can de-risk your business by buying differently and buying better. And John, in his opening address, talked very much about working very closely with suppliers and getting them on your journey. And I loved it when he talked about the marketing team being the activists going out there, getting marketing and sales on board and really getting them up to speed with all of the ins and outs of this. They are going to be your best advocates, so that's really important. And you can see the example here, similar to the donut diagram that George showed. The supply chain bit is absolutely huge. If everybody on the planet measured their scope 1 and 2, we wouldn't need to have these discussions about the supply chain and scope 3. But we're still at the very early stages of really understanding what it means to get a grip on net zero. So supply chain is absolutely critical. Economic growth is driven by primary production, by the extractive industries, by agriculture and land management, and it's getting those things right means that we're going to get net zero right. And it's important to review your procurement process as part of your good practice environmental management system in order to get to net zero. Next slide, please. And in working with suppliers, you'll find you've got the good, the bad and the ugly down there. This is an example from a client project we're working on, and we do this as standard. Once we've identified who are the big emitters, and they're coloured in pale red in this table, the red ones are particularly those with a high level of emissions per pound spent. So you know that those are going to be your priority, and because this is a sector average emissions factor per pound spent, you know that you'll be able to get to, they may well be doing things that mean their emissions per pound spent is actually slightly lower. And where you can identify the good guys, those suppliers who are already reporting to the Carbon Disclosure Project, are already signed up to a science-based target. They're already on that journey. You know that you're going to get some good information back from them. So it's about working with your value chain and collaborating so that you really are all on the same journey together. Next slide, please. Thank you. I'll hand over to Simon now, who's going to take you through the project side of things.
Thank you, Carol, and good morning, everybody. Next few slides we've got here just looking at some of the practical applications of implementing projects, touching on very high-level implementation and things to consider in relation to costs, finance, and perhaps to delivery mechanisms. There's no real detail, but it's just to give you a flavour of things perhaps to consider at this point in time. Next slide, please. With all projects, there are essentially sort of typical implementation, 5 implementation stages to consider, whatever the project, if it be a strategic program of behaviour change maybe, or a low carbon installation. The starting point is always to develop a business case such that you can understand what those benefits are. So you have to develop the conceptual design, the strategy, what you're trying to achieve, set out your scope of works and define your specifications such that everyone knows what the boundaries are associated with the solution or the opportunity. But more importantly, you're just starting to define your project costs and the benefits to the business or the organisation. Once that's been delivered and potentially approved, you've got to consider your funding options. And I've got a slide that just touches on sort of some things to consider on that later on. Following on from that and progressing your project, you've obviously got to think about procurement. So you've got to finalise your costs. You can engage with the supply chain, your subcontractors or your specialist resources in that respect. You've got to decide how you're going to negotiate with them, how you're going to tender a project if that's the case, and then how you're going to appoint and commence. It's all part of delivering that project, and it's all very important as part of each of these stages. Then you move on to the project delivery, and at that point it's important to develop a program and obviously carry out that program delivery. And following on from the project delivery, you move into sort of what the final stage after the project's been delivered, if it be a program or an installation, is to ensure that you're getting ongoing benefits and what those benefits are. So it might be appointing O&M providers or setting up a M&T or proposition of measuring and verification. So they're essentially the 5 stages. Next slide, please. What is important when considering all projects is to capture all the activities that are required, if it be costs or resources associated with delivering those projects. And often we find that a number of the early stage sort of project development aspects are not always thought about or captured, and can lead to delays in project delivery or additional costs that no one's thought about. And some of these points are just giving you an indication of some of the things to consider. So starting, once you've got a conceptual design and the business case approved, clearly you're moving into defining that project in more detail. So you need to perhaps move into detailed design, make sure that you've captured all aspects of the design such that the delivery can be delivered. You outline a project program, make sure all stakeholders understand how that program or that project is going to affect them and impact on business as usual activities. Clearly, we've talked about procurement, but at that point, you've got to engage with the supply chain. You've got to understand how you're going to assess them. You may have approved contractors and you may set out a tendering mechanism. All these aspects can add cost, certainly time and resource to a program or a project, and therefore can have a significant, or not significant, but certainly have an impact on the outcome of the project in terms of time. One thing that often we see is overlooked is obviously the legal input. Clearly, if you're doing a relatively large low carbon technology solution installation, you're going to have to engage with suppliers and obviously engage with them through some sort of contract or agreement. So it's important to engage with your legal team, maybe in-house, or appoint external lawyers to ensure that you've got the right contractual arrangements to meet those requirements. Some of the more practical aspects to consider with any project, especially in low carbon solutions, is what's the impact on the grid? And so an early engagement with the DNO is good and important. Certainly for solar projects, it's important you have to engage with the DNO to get some sort of approval. Equally, from a planning perspective, you may have to seek permitted planning applications. So again, local authority engagement is certainly important. And it may be that you're pursuing a sort of ground source, water source, open loop heat pump solution or a geothermal solution. So you may have to engage from an environmental point of view with something like the EA. And again, these add time, costs and resources to any project. And like anything, any project at the early stages, it's important to understand the risks and the impact of business as usual. When considering more the obvious and direct project costs, it's also important to engage clearly with the supplier or the contractor to ensure that there's no delays in delivery of product, such that you've got a good idea of how long that installation will take place. And obviously it's important to appoint and understand how you're going to contract and project manage a project, and how other in-house resources are impacted. Next slide, please. So in terms of funding, there are a number of ways to clearly funding projects and programs. But what I've just touched on is three fairly obvious solutions that certainly you could consider. The first, obviously, with any project is to, if you've got in-house capital, that is probably your best and obvious way forward. You're going to get your best returns from utilising in-house capital, but often you've got challenges with perhaps limited capital available, and certainly other competing projects that may not have, or may have better returns on investment, and therefore you struggle. But it's important to be able to move things forward. So the second opportunity is to look at perhaps third-party project finance. And there are many investors these days who are keen to invest in low carbon projects. There'll be solar, heat pumps, geothermal, or AD plants. And finance organisations like Barclays, Investec, Close Brothers and others would certainly be keen to discuss any potential project. In addition to sort of large major projects, we have engaged with funders who also will be happy to bundle together perhaps a suite of energy conservation measures to allow you to fund and move projects forwards which have got lower value but can be bundled together. The third funding option is pretty interesting and pretty good, and that's using power purchase agreements. There are a number of suppliers or energy services organisations that are happy to, if you like, invest the capital in the solution. This is quite prevalent in the solar sector, but also CHP and other sectors, where the supplier will basically fund the project, and therefore and you end up paying for that project through, or the capital of that project through, discounted heat or electricity prices. The benefits of a power purchase agreement is that a lot of the risk transfer of sort of the performance of the kit and the installation are transferred to the supplier. Next slide, please. So in terms of a summary and sort of finalising some of the key aspects associated with project delivery, I think one of the key things that we found, and certainly is often absent, which is surprisingly, is making sure that all stakeholders are engaged right from the beginning to understand what the project's about, what you're trying to do, how that impacts on their aspects of the organisation and production. Equally, capture all the costs and resources. As we talked about in a couple of slides previously, it's important to ensure that those costs and resources are known at the early stage. Obviously, set out a project programme and share that amongst everybody. Understand and manage those risks. That's important with any organisation or any project. But I think probably one of the main things with any delivery of a programme or project is to maintain good and open communications, such that all parties are on board, understand how things are progressing, and when there are issues, and there will be issues, they are discussed and debated appropriately. Clearly, it's important to have regular project reviews, both from a progress perspective, but also from clearly cost and budget. And finally, what's important is once the project's delivered, is to ensure that you're going to maintain those benefits from an ongoing perspective. So put in place a measurement and verification process to ensure that those performances are delivered. Thank you. Next slide, please. Handing back to Carol now for talk about people.
Thanks, Simon. Next slide, please. We've heard an awful lot about how important it is to engage people all the way through the setup, governance and project process. And this is very much a two-way communication strategy. Top down have got to own it, and bottom up have got to be able to talk about what's working and where they can see things can work better. Because there are going to be good ideas from across the entire business. Your employees know the business best, and they will have really good ideas as to how things could be improved. And I like this quote from Jim Goodnight, CEO at SAS Institute in the States. Treat employees like they matter, like they make a difference, and they will. And that's really true. So absolutely everybody needs to be involved in this. And there's a lot of psychology in a culture change process. Personalities matter, and there will be the enthusiasts, the champions, the people who want to get really involved and lead from the front. And then you get the skeptics. Oh, we tried that before and it didn't work. So you do, and you get those blockers too. And the psychology behind the pushback can be interesting, because sometimes it can be seen as a threat, or I don't want to have to change the way I do things. I think this works just fine. And it's people don't want to get out of their comfort zone. So it's a hearts and minds approach, and it can take a lot of time. So it's got to be done carefully. And again, you know your business best. So it's worth sitting down and planning out how to make it happen. And there's always going to be something in the business strategy that you can use as a hook. There are going to be really good hard evidence from within the business and outside of it, coming from customers and suppliers, as to why a certain change is going to be important. It's critical to make it. And it's then working out how do you put this communication strategy into effect to align with the timeframes, the milestones that are being examined and need to be agreed. Next slide, please. So you've almost certainly got some working groups and committees in place already looking at other aspects of business improvement, or employee satisfaction, or how to make sure that your customers are happy. There will be things going on in your business already that you can look at using as ways of getting that behaviour change process in place. But don't just make it voluntary. Don't make it something that people do on top of their day job. Champions are absolutely brilliant at helping the whole process along. And if you've got some good champions within the business, definitely make use of them. But this is about changing your business. This is about changing the way that you do things. And I think that came across in spades from John's talk about what Interface are doing. So where you can see that a change is needed to a particular activity and what that means for people's post-holder job descriptions, rewrite those job descriptions, make it formal, make it part of your people's jobs, and link it to performance appraisal and forward job planning, so that they absolutely know what's required of them. And also, if any of your champions leave, you could lose all of that momentum. So if you can formalise as much of this as possible and make people really comfortable that it's part of what they do and part of what they get paid for, it should work much more effectively. And again, looking at how people are working within the business, and I've mentioned the environmental management system, ISO 14001 before, but this is worth getting everyone involved to create an integrated management system. And in that way, you'll find that you can make much faster progress. Next slide, please. And again, we have in a previous webinar talked about Unipart around the behaviour change piece. they are just a fantastic example of how that way of thinking, that way of working has been absolutely embedded in everything they do, top down and bottom up, and it is now their business philosophy. And you can look back to this mindset. I think it was adopted into a lot of companies looking at Japan, particularly in the 70s, about this imbuing a sense of family and collective working towards positive, which was very much a cultural mindset, and it's not maybe it was seen with a bit of skepticism back in the 70s, but certainly looking at the way we need to change how we operate to make the economy work better, to make society more equal and equitable in order to get to net zero, then the Unipart way is a really, really good example to look at. And I would urge you to have a look at how they make that work, and the huge fun they appear to have in doing so. So there's a link there, so you can have a look at the setup in more detail and see if any of that can be applied to your business. Or you may well be doing some things already, and you can see where you can continue to develop what you're doing already. Next slide, please. And again, as part of the engagement piece, how you engage with your suppliers and your supply chain is really critical, because you will find that quite a lot of your key suppliers do share your ethos, do share your business values, but because you perhaps haven't had that discussion with them yet, you haven't realised to what extent you're on that same journey. They could be doing even more than you are. They could be doing things that now that you know about it, it means that you can make more change into your business activities. You can speed up the operational change that you were thinking of making, because you know that your suppliers are working with you. And it's also really important to find out, in terms of leaders and blockers, which suppliers aren't really taking very much action, and having a discussion with them as to why that might be the case. It's not about refusing to work with a supplier if they're not prepared to share your same values and ethos and way of working. It's about finding out what their difficulties are, and they may have some real difficulties that you may be able to help them with. And we have talked about insetting before, and this is where you look to work with your suppliers. You look down the supply chain to see where, if you, rather than invest in offsetting, if you can invest in your supply chain and help your suppliers reduce their emissions, it then means that the product or services that they're giving to you are going to be lower carbon, are going to be helping you in your Scope 3 emissions reduction journey. And it's very often surprising, or maybe not that surprising, that we find a lot of clients don't really know that much about their suppliers, and they talk about procurement, but it's been more about just buying. We just buy this. It's exactly what we need. It's good quality and it's good price. And now the next question to ask, as John was saying, yeah, it's good quality, good price, but also what about the environmental impacts, or the socio-ethical impacts related to those environmental impacts? Because those social and ethical impacts are coming to coincide very strongly around human rights and due environmental diligence. And this is starting to come into particularly EU legislation, that if you don't conform with the regulations, and this is now part of regulatory setup in Germany, starting from this year, and if you don't have the evidence to be able to demonstrate how you can meet those regulations, then you're likely to be fined. So I would take that as the direction of travel that regulation is going in as well. Next slide, please. So it is very much about creating a value chain. There's collaboration with your suppliers, get them to collaborate with their suppliers, so it's cascading back down the supply chain, looking at all of those risks that you can map out and try and mitigate and minimize, but also the opportunities. There will be massive opportunities down there, and the sooner that you find out about those things, the more that you can start to realize them and improve your business resilience and improve your emissions reduction activities. So it's about really embracing the circular economy. Next slide, please. So I'll hand back now to George, who's going to take us through the final part of today's session. Thanks.
Thank you, Carol. Some really good points there, and I'm a massive believer in effective behaviour change. I think according to the Committee for Climate Change, they estimated that it could be responsible for up to 50% reductions in greenhouse gas emissions across all organisations. So very much an area that is undervalued by many, I believe, but a real opportunity. Next slide, please. So going back to an earlier slide, many organisations, as I said, have done all the good things. They've got to a point where you have your strategy, you have an action plan, but it's now what? What do you now do? Next slide, please. So we've talked about a number of areas there, and I think right at the top of this webinar, John and Interface's story made it very clear that they started this journey a long time ago, before net zero was even a word or a phrase, and have shown that it's they've taken it all the way and made it a real commercial opportunity. So that's a key message as far as I'm concerned. But in terms of what next and practical steps, my starting point would always be data. And I have a colleague in the company who would be clapping at this point. But data is absolutely key. It's a starting point for us. We optimize existing systems. We make sure that you've got good quality, consistent data. That doesn't mean you have to put in hundreds of meters. It just means that you need to have that good quality stream of data to enable you to verify any interventions you've taken and projects you've undertaken, and understand what's going on across your organization. Practical projects is something that people, particularly with an engineering background, really like to get involved in, because it's tangible and it's visible, and it's easier to understand. And Simon gave a very good talk through the whole approach to projects, but projects is only part of the picture. As Carol alluded to, talking about the engagement of suppliers, as did John, and the importance of behaviour change, and really making the responsibility for achieving net zero and delivering that journey everyone's responsibility. It can't lie in the hands of one person who happens to have the title sustainability manager, and it can't lie just in a small team. It is the responsibility of every individual in every organisation. It's everything that we do, from the moment we get up in the morning to how we get to work, to what we do at work, to what we buy, the choices we make, both at an individual level and at an organisational level. So it is all of our responsibilities, and there are lots of things that we can do, as Carol and Simon and John have all talked about this morning. Next slide, please. So from our perspective, one of the things that we do find is that organisations have constraints naturally in terms of available resources, knowledge, and capital. Well, Simon talked about when capital is needed for implementation of projects, there are a number of options open, and we can help you explore those options, whether it's PPAs, EPCs, or whether it's third-party funding. There are a number of different ways in which you can deliver those tangible projects. But in terms of resource and having the time to do it, I mean, we engage a whole wide variety of organisations across all sectors, and the common challenge for many of those is, I simply don't have time. I know I need to do it, and we have to do it, but how am I going to actually get this done? And companies like ourselves can offer an ongoing service, either project by project, or just an open book ongoing service where we can provide that expertise and legs on the ground, etc., to help you implement some of those practical actions and improvements. So it's worth having that conversation. You're not on your own, I think, and also collaborate, talk to others that perhaps might have gone through this themselves, and find out how they've done it. But certainly there is support out there, and come and talk to us if you're unsure. Next slide, please. And this is another tool, but there are numerous tools out there in a way that you have all these improvements, particularly if you're a multi-site organization. It's quite hard to keep on top and to be able to track these improvements. So you've identified them all, you want to do something with them, but you're not sure what's going on across your estate. So there are tools such as Energy Activator that'll help you to keep track of those opportunities, and as they become developed and implemented. And of course, Simon did talk about the importance of M&V and the importance of verification of performance of those projects, not just if you're in a contractual arrangement with a supplier, but also for your own benefit, because to be able to go to the FD next time and say, right, I need X amount of money for these projects, they will naturally want to know, or they will naturally want to know what has been the effectiveness of previous projects that have been financed. So you need to be able to monitor those and repeat the successful ones, and obviously adjust those that haven't been as successful as thought. So tools like Energy Activator will help you give that central governance and transparency across your estate. So again, there are tools out there that will help make life easier. Next slide, please. And of course, whilst training is only a small part of behaviour change, nevertheless, it's important. I do find, or we find that when we ask the question of organisations, particularly those that have fairly high staff turnover, like retail, for instance, or hospitality, in their induction training, is energy, for instance, even mentioned? And 99% of the time, I'd say it's not. And so using tools like e-learning energy awareness, such as Be Energy, is an important part of at least giving that a message right from day one that yes, energy is important to us, and yes, sustainability is important to us, and yes, you have an important part to play, because it's a cumulative effect of those small interventions, those small changes that make the big difference. Next slide, please. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague Jane. If we have time to pick up any questions, Jane, I'll leave that with you. But thank you for your attendance this morning.
Hi, George. Yeah, we've got a few questions there. If you could look on the Q&A button, George, you can see the questions there, some good ones as well. I suggest we start. Carol's actually answering the first one. Do you want to do that verbally, Carol, or would you like to carry on answering that, typing an answer to that?
I'm in the middle of typing an answer.
Okay, you can. Simon, maybe you'd like to pick up a question from Neil Ross. Any practical tips for a PPA when the building is owned by a landlord? Can you see that question there?
It's probably best if I do some write that one and respond. But in practical terms, there's no simple practical tips other than good communication, early communication, to sound out the benefits of what you're trying to achieve with the landlord. But I'll put a more considered response after the webinar. Okay, there are a number of questions that have been answered there. We'll round them all up and email them out afterwards, because we've now got to 11 o'clock, so bang on time to complete. Anybody got anything to say to finish off? George, do you want to say anything?
Well, there's one there which I'm naturally going to pick up, and that's from an anonymous attendee, so that's an unusual name, which says there are a number of potential partners out there to help companies implement a net zero strategy. Why choose JRP? There are a number of very good reasons why I would recommend choosing us, is because we've been ahead of the curve for some time, and that's part of our job. We work across all sectors, so we have a wide and diverse experience of many different strategies, and each strategy is different for every organization. And as I said, we have a background in which is very practical and pragmatic. So we know that when we develop action plans in particular, we know that they're deliverable and they're practical, and they will make a difference to you.
That's great. That's lovely. Thank you very much, everybody. I think we'll call that it for today. We will be sending out the link to the recording if everybody needs it, and some people have asked for the slide pack, and so we'll be sending out. We're giving people the option to have that as well. That's great. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.